Okay, you can have people in on the waiting room as well, Manisha. If you...
Yep. It is, so we are now live on YouTube, and then I'm going to start admitting people in.
People in on the waiting room as
Yep,
well,
okay. Yep. And then we'll start letting people in. So we are now live on YouTube, and then I'm going to start admitting people in. Okay.
Hi, Shania, you are a blogger today.
Hi, yeah, I am.
Nice to see you.
Okay, Claudia, I'm going to unmute myself and my so I'm going to mute myself and my video, but I am lurking in the background if you need me.
Perfect. It's recording as well as live streaming? Yeah.
Yep. I'm going to start recording now. As soon as it hits 3, I'll start recording.
Okay. So welcome everyone. Hopefully we'll have a few more people join us. As you can see, we are live streaming to YouTube and recording. So if anybody doesn't want to show their face, we'll understand why, but we do love to see everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to make sure that everyone who needs to can connect. And then we'll get going with our seminar on teaching economists to non-specialists. Hi, Camino. Hi, Ramin. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. Okay, so we're on 3 p.m. London time. My name is Professor Clodagh Jenkins, and I'm a professorial teaching fellow in the Economics and Public Policy Department at Imperial College London and Associate Director for the Centre for Teaching and Learning Economics. I'm going to be chairing today's session, and I'm delighted to have 3 colleagues joining us who I know through various different roles and for various numbers of years. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I thought I'd just spend a minute explaining a little bit about what the seminar is about and what we'll be discussing. So when I moved to Imperial from UCL, I moved to teaching non-specialists quite a lot, but also through CTEL, I've been heavily involved with teaching for the Foreign Office, and I've worked in various roles where I work with engineers and lawyers and non-economists. So I've always had a kind of interest in how do we explain economics to non-specialists, and obviously now more teaching them. So we thought it'd be interesting to have a look at this issue because most people, particularly in the US, obviously, where people don't choose their major until their senior years, are always trying to persuade people of the value of learning economics without putting them off, essentially. So our 3 speakers today all have different angles on this, different experiences. And I think we're going to have a nice chat. Hopefully you all know the rules of CTEL seminars are keep yourself muted while people are talking. Use the chat for comments and questions, and Sylvia will pass on to me as chair if there are any particular questions for the panel. And then towards the end, we'll hopefully have some time where we can let people unmute if they want to ask questions in person as well. So we'll find opportunities where you can raise your hands, given that we're a small group. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is alphabetically ask each of our panel members to introduce themselves, what their interest is in this idea of teaching economics to non-specialists. So Eileen, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm Eileen. I'm a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University. I'm also part of the editorial board at Core Economics Education. So my experiences are being involved in writing a textbook for social scientists called Economy, Society, and Public Policy, and also preparing a set of empirical projects called Doing Economics, where students will learn data handling skills in the context of important policy issues. Yeah, so my research is in behavioral economics applied micro, but I also do some research in education economics, so mainly evaluating core. So what does learning economics, how does learning economics change the way that students think about the world?
Thank you. James?
Hi, everybody. My name is James Tierney. I am currently self-employed. I was at Penn State most recently teaching large lectures of macroeconomics. I'm working on a couple of projects in the, I guess you'd say, research realm of learning science and how we can get more graduate students and early career economists to focus on the evidence-based strategies in the classroom. That's kind of my biggest project right now. I also own an improv theater here in State College, Pennsylvania, which is beautiful out, and it's 10 a.m. here, bright and early. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to talk about it. I do some work with the Foreign Office each session to come in. So I have a lot of ideas on and experience on how that works for people who really don't have a lot of econ coming in. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Pedro.
Hi everyone, thanks Clara. So I'm an associate professor in behavioral economics at the SADE Business School in Spain. Mainly, I did a transition like 4 or 5 years ago from being in a much more research-oriented institution to a business school. And in the last few years, I've been teaching MBAs, introduction to microeconomics to MBAs, and also a course on behavioral economics, which is my area of research, both to MBA students, but also to executive MBAs and other institutions to try to talk about the experimental method and try to talk about evidence-based policies and behavioral and all these things. I'm also a member, I was the past president of the Spanish Economic Association Education Committee, and I'm also with CRODA, I'm a member of the European Economic Association Education Committee. So very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the sort of discussion that we had, sort of semi-prepared, I think is the best way to put it, we're going to talk a bit about teaching non-economists and then also what it kind of means for us as a profession as well and our interactions with non-economists. So I'm going to start with Pedro because, as he mentioned, he does do a lot of teaching now, and so he used to teach, I guess, more traditional economic students and has moved quite a lot into teaching non-economists. So I guess the question is, what's the biggest difference teaching different types of students, and how have you adapted for the biggest difference?
So I think the biggest difference is expectations. So I think we still do a bad job at selling what economists do, and people still don't know it. So the first thing I always have to tell in my classes is that they shouldn't be asking me about financial advice, because the only time I gave financial advice to my parents when they inherited some money was a complete failure, and I'm still a complete failure even if I'm in giving this type of advice. So I think the first thing is to let them know. This thing that they teach us the first day we study economics, this is about constrained choice and the small science of having to choose and all these things. People still think we are talking about money and we are talking about finances, which of course we're doing that, but many other things. So setting up the expectations is the first thing. The second one, I think, is the credibility about, we are not, even if I'm a professional magician, and this is something I may tell you about later, I'm not a good predictor. So we are not, as economists, we are not here to predict how things are going to go. And if we do it many times exposed. So, we have to set up expectations about that. We are bad at predicting when the next crisis is going to be. Although nowadays, basically the next crisis is every single day, right? And finally, I think the third difference is finding the right level of math, up to which point, how we use math and how math is useful for some of the things that we do, but also, try not to scare them away with the level of difficulty. Many of the economic principles that we have to teach them, they can be explained without math or with very basic math. So I think the main difference is about telling them not to scare them away and telling them that what we do is interesting and useful.
Oh, you're muted. It's all right.
Just trying to stop my heavy breathing on the thing. So thinking about, those differences, does that make it really challenging to teach non-economists? And if so, what kind of adaptations do you make on the ground to macro teaching or any other kind of teaching that you do?
I'll jump in here. I don't think I guess it's challenging, but I think it's challenging in a different way. I absolutely love it. And I think kind of adding on to what Pedro was saying about, making sure that, this isn't finance and getting that is asking students early on, like what their assumptions are. And so when I was teaching at Penn State, 750 macro students, the first day I would give them a very quick online poll where I took like 50 concepts that I knew we'd be going over in the entire class and had them rank them 1 to 5. And the way that I told them that was 1 is you've never, ever heard of this term before. 5, you could come up here and teach this. And like, where are you? And then I would bring those terms up on the screen and I would show them like, okay, here are the terms you like, know, you don't know, like, and have them do little group discussions. And that gives me a little idea of, okay, where are they coming from first? I know Bill Goff, who's at Penn State as well, he does an early semester survey to try and get student expectations and student like understanding, like, what are you coming in with? What misperceptions are you coming in with? And so I think the challenge is recognizing that we do know a lot more than they do, and not getting fooled by that. Be like, oh, this is obvious. You should definitely know that.
I'm just going to stay on mute. As a sort of fellow microeconomist, game theory person, when you think about the maths and the models, have you got any examples of particular things that you found that actually they don't need to know this technical approach in order to understand the concept that you can share?
So I think game theory leads itself very nicely to having them interact into some typical prisoner's dilemma kind of situation or whatever, and showing them how they don't need the math, but that the math principles that you apply and you may explain later on, they make a lot of sense. So make them play in game theoretic situations and ask them how they do what they do and why they do what they do, and then try to apply them to add the math and add the methodology and add the analysis a little bit later. Actually helps quite a lot.
Yeah, I think one of the things that'd be quite nice for James to do is to do a poll of lecturers and say, do you really think like people need to know indifference curves to understand consumer choice? Do you really need to know? Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I think that's my big one is I would never draw an indifference curve except where the book tells me I have to, or somebody, because I'm like, you never use them ever again. Whereas people understand consumer choice because they're consumers. So there's many ways that you can explain it to them, I think. Whereas those other ones, I think something like economic cost and economic profit versus the accountancy terms are ones that take quite a lot longer, I would imagine, to well, people probably, James, in your list say they know what that means and then don't quite understand that we have a different approach to doing it.
Right. And I really think what you just said there about, when is everyone ever going to use the indifference curve again? Right. So one of my private tutoring clients is an MBA student taking managerial econ, and they they're drawing monopoly graphs and then, she's trying to understand every single question she could be asked on her final. And I'm like, that's not how we need to do this. Like, let's get away from that, because you're never, ever in your entire life, ever again, I can guarantee you, going to have to draw a monopoly graph with a marginal cost curve and you're never going to do that. The only people who ever do that are us, who are teaching other people how to do that. So the real thing is understanding the stuff behind it, so then you can apply it to other problems. And that's what you're doing as an MBA student. You are going to, in your own business or whatever business you're doing, you're going to have all this information that that you're given, and you're going to have all these tools, and how do we mash them up to solve a problem? And once I get through to my students that's what we are teaching you as economists, we're not telling you, hey, when you go to a job interview, they're going to ask you about an average total cost curve and what's this. They're not going to ask you that, but they're going to give you 5 things and 5 things you don't know, and you have to solve for them. And once I get that through a lot of my students' heads, they're like, oh, that's why I'm here. And that really, really helps. Sorry, I just ranted a little bit, but I had that conversation with her yesterday. So
but I think that's exactly spot on. And I think, so I think going back to Pietro's point about expectations, there's probably also an issue about building trust. So in our heads, we build trust with fellow economists by being, you know, academic and bright and using the right terms. But if, you know, you're teaching somebody who could be quite senior in a corporate, that you do need to build their trust by saying, you know, it's worth your while being here, you're going to get something out of this. And I think that's the flip side of managing their expectations, is making sure that they believe, I'm teaching you economics. It might not look like the textbook that you went out and bought on Amazon that you didn't mean to buy, but I'm going to be teaching you what you need to know from it. I think that's quite useful. Mentioning textbooks, Eileen, brings me nicely to you, who is the master of writing textbooks that people can understand. I guess, can you talk us through a little bit how you approach writing textbooks for people who aren't starting out economists or expecting to ever become economists?
Yeah, certainly. So I think what Pedro had said earlier about the math. So what you just have to assume, there's less assumed knowledge when you're writing textbooks for non-economists, and there might be some fear of maths or stats or computer programming as well, or just even using Excel to do some sort of statistical analysis. So in that sense, it's better to start off with an intuitive approach and building like confidence. So one feature that I tried to do is I have videos that walk them through exactly how to do something, or having annotated screenshots, and starting with a really intuitive approach so they can see when they click through things, then they can actually get some output that really builds their confidence that this is, you know, something that I can do, or, you know, and also just focusing on describing things with words first and then showing them the equation later, or not at all, and also interpreting statistical output, because when we're talking about when they're in the doing jobs someday, they won't really need to explain exactly what a correlation coefficient, what the formula is, but they just need to know how to interpret it. So just focusing on those, the intuition, and also building confidence.
Thank you. And this is a question for anyone really sort of related to all of this, is how consciously did you sit down and say, right, this is a group of non-specialists that I'm talking to. So I know I did my macro PhD courses or my micro PhD courses, and this is what I know. And now I have to teach it to a group of people who don't have the same grounding. Did you just kind of go with it and gut instinct, or did you look around to see what other people were doing?
So I think it's a combination of two things, right? One is experience. The very first time you have to teach to non-economists, you're always going to crash, and no matter how prepared you've been and how many people you have taught and how many materials you have borrowed from other people, you're going to crash. I mean, there's an adaptation that needs to be done there, and I think we are getting better at this, and of course here that's what we're here for today. But still, we are 3 galaxies away from the type of thing that really interest our potential students and the things that we really should be teaching to them, such as we need to have a bad experience to really be able to do other things. I think the materials that we have and the experience of many good teachers that have been doing this for a while is getting there, and therefore people will crash less than we did. But I can promise you, the first time I had to teach to non-economists was a nice experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you're learning on the job. I guess, but like with all teaching, you go in focusing on content and then you think about other things. Good question in the chat, actually, which goes with this. So one of the issues is that you do tend to have heterogeneous classrooms. So if I think about one of the masters I'm teaching at the moment with 180 students, I think 60 of them have some form of undergraduate economics, but not, you know, sort of 100% economics, and the rest have come from all sorts of degrees. So how do you cope with that? The different, you know, some come in thinking they're already economists, some have math, some don't, some have finance.
And the problem is that some of the ones who have taken economic courses, they are confident that they know something, but they actually they know less, or they are less willing to learn than those who are open and they are exposed for the first time, right? So the heterogeneity is not clear. It's like I have the economics and the non-economic students. It's much more heterogeneous than that. In my case, the way I cope about it is I normally have a non-compulsory pre-course class in which people can sign up. And that's the one that I use to set up expectations and to try to tell them this is not about math, but in any case, the math that you need may be these little things, these 3 things that you did in high school, but that's it. So just the first day of class, they are all up to speed, at least in terms of what to expect. That's what I do. I have a pre-course class that they can choose to go. And pretty much everyone ends up going.
Eileen, is there anything you do in the textbook space or in the classroom around that heterogeneous point?
Yeah, so we do have, so for the people who don't have that much background knowledge in, say, Excel, there are some guided walkthroughs for them. So of course, the students who already know it or think they know it don't need to go over that. And we also have some extension material as well. So I think, yeah, so in designing the materials, just having things at different levels. And then there's, the middle ground where we hope that everybody will be able to do that.
Anything else, James, to deal with mixed audience?
So I don't have a lot of experience teaching at the upper level. So mainly my experience comes in the in like intermediate macro, where everyone is supposed to have intro to macro, but since there's so many different people who may, there could be transfer students, there could be students who have taken it with different instructors. I never know exactly what level they're at. So I always would spend the first week or two doing what I would consider like advanced review, where I'm like, this is the material you need to know, because I want to get everybody on the same page. And I think it goes back to building that trust. Like I would tell the big class, like you would feel uncomfortable if you went into a class and you were behind from right at the beginning. So even if you find this stuff material, use this as a time to get started and try and get on the same plane before we start moving into that new material. I also, what I've done when I've done stuff for the Center for Foreign Office is not knowing where these students are coming from, and basically allowed them to open up and ask questions like, hey, I think I'm supposed to know what GDP is, but what exactly is it? And then allowing some of the students who do understand and have the background to then explain it. And that's kind of built a pretty good community with that as well.
Yeah, I think the idea, I used to do so at UCL, all the UCL students were economists, but you had people from joint degrees, people from single honors degrees, but also we had a lot of affiliate students from the States. So I did that thing of a quiz up front, making sure that, that they knew what profit was or what consumer surplus was, and said, this is what I'm going to assume, this is in your prerequisites. But obviously if you really don't get this, come and ask me in week 1, not in week 10. That was always the main aim. So another question in the chat is around learning objectives or learning outcomes, and how you set them for non-specialists and how you link them to the program. And I guess there may be a difference there between if the program's all non-specialist, that might be less difficult, but if it's kind of a mixed program, how do you do that? Eileen, do you want to start and then I'll move through the others?
Yeah, so in terms of the kind of learning objectives for non-specialists, I think that it would kind of be similar for what you want for the economists, in that you want them to be able to go out into the real world and to be able to explain to have these set of tools that they use to explain what they see. I don't think it's very different from being a non-specialist or a specialist, because even for the economists, they would need to be able to communicate with the non-specialist anyway. So that's my take on that question. In terms of linking it to the program objectives, I don't have any experience with programs that involve non-specialists, so I will defer to the other panelists for that.
Pietro, do you want to have a go at just generally learning objectives and linking?
So what I generally do is, instead of monitoring them or testing them, so did they learn this concept or the other, basically when I explain the learning objectives, what I say is, this is basically a managerial economics course. So what I want you to do is, at the end of the day, pick up a company and show, my objective is so that the economic principles that you have learned through this course, they apply to this company. And it can be something that they choose themselves. So these are MBAs, so many of them, they choose their own company. Some of them, they're family-owned company, which is kind of funny sometimes when you find out. But the thing is, how do you apply all these concepts? How would you apply these concepts really in your everyday life? And actually, I've been in your business life, right? And actually, I've been very surprised. I've been given, through the years teaching this type of courses, I have learned many applications of principles that I was taking for granted, like the Bible when I was reading, when I was studying Mascolel. I could find that the students are very good at finding a way to use these things. So now I use them. I use it as feedback. I also use it as examples in my classes. So I like one of the things I like about teaching non-specialists is that it's a two-way road, right? You also learn from them, and you learn many of the applications. Things that you would never have thought of. This applies to this concept. Sometimes they are bogus, right? But many times it does apply, and it's funny and it's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. James, any last word on sort of what you value about teaching non-economists and what the challenges are before we move on to the wider professional implications of all of this?
I've always been pretty independent from like the university I've worked at with like what learning objectives were. So like that's been always nice for me. And I've always kind of felt this, if I have my majors, even like an intro level course, right? Because like if you have an intro level course, you're gonna have some majors and non-majors. The non-majors just like the university is making me be here, and so I don't want to be here at all. And like if I can get them to understand why companies do something, or why the government does something, or why individuals do something, like just understand why, then I feel like I've done a good job. Like, okay, this is why they're using price discrimination. This is why the prisoner's dilemma is doing this. And then for the economists, I try and like bump it up just a little bit. And can I get them to tell me how they're going to do it, right? So like just a little bit deeper. And so is there a way to kind of separate that? Now with assessments, I'm teaching a very small class in entrepreneurship right now with 6 students, which is amazing because I got them each an individual education plan. Like they each have a different final because it's what they wanted. When I'm teaching 700 people, it's really difficult. It's not impossible to try and give people their option of like which level. But something I think is best for education to be like, this is where you are, and let's get you to this point.
Yeah, no, I think so I actually found the reverse happening when I was in UCL, that I was given learning outcomes, from pre-existing courses that say things like, by the end of this course, you will know what marginal cost is, for example. And that, that's such a bad way to write a learning outcome anyway, that you just kind of go, okay, but you can write them so, as Eileen was saying, whatever the student, you're able to understand, I don't know, how government makes a policy, or why growth matters to welfare, or that kind of thing. And then, you're going to hit that for everyone at, like you say, James, at a different level. And I think that's what's really important. So I think coming out of this, what I'm hearing, and anyone in the audience, if you're hearing anything else, please shout, is, teaching non-economists is different. Maybe harder or easier, or just the same?
I think it's more interesting. It's
Okay.
less predictable. The questions in a typical economics course are always the same. How did you do that derivative? How did you do that? Why? How you calculate that? Here, the questions can come from everywhere, and you need to be on your toes all the time, right? Which makes it more challenging, but more fun.
More challenging, more fun. Same economics, but taking out the stuff that you think people don't need to know to understand the why. I'm guessing all of you probably teach in a similar way because you have dynamic ways of teaching anyway, which kind of makes me wonder about, in our seminar panels, we always self-select the people who are good at these things in. So do you think it's something that you would recommend every economist does? To teach some non-economists?
I mean, I think it's what individuals want to get out of it, right? Like, do I think it's good for personal growth for people to do that? Sure. But if someone's like, all I care about is researching and writing papers, then, you know, selfishly, I don't want them teaching anybody because I'd rather give it to all of us who, you know, put time and effort into learning, you know, evidence-based strategies and stuff. I do want to echo what Pedro said. Like, it's so interesting and like when I'm tutoring, like, let's say a managerial MBA student, and they're like, here's a case study we're doing. And then all of a sudden they have supply and demand mixed up, like upward sloping demand. And I'm just like, whoa, hold on, wait, you know, this isn't something that I would expect from, you know, from you, but I've got to remember that, you know, they've maybe taken 1 or 2 econ classes and are so much interested in other parts of their program that to like pull it back and figure out, you know, the easy way is to just be like, that's wrong, here's how you do it. And most business professionals are gonna be like, okay, great, because that's all I care about. Like, I'm just trying to get this done, right? And so how do you as an educator be like, okay, I've got a job to make sure that they're learning this. So let's ask, why does that look wrong? What is that type of stuff? So I think it's challenging in that way to not just give answers and be like, move on, and challenge them when they do get something wrong.
So I think there's chat going on in the chat about the FT and reading materials and stuff like that. Does it tend to be accessible things like The Economist or Eileen's very useful textbooks, or do you use different materials or the same materials for The Economist and the Non-Economists?
My goal, oh, sorry, go ahead, Pedro. No, you go.
Go ahead, James.
Oh, me? Okay.
Yeah.
I've always used, I mean, even when I was teaching intro classes where there's people who want to be economists and like go to grad school, and there's people who hate me because I'm teaching them econ. I would have the same, like, I'd be like, here's the level. And for us, I mean, we probably Financial Times with Wall Street Journal, like I need you to be able to pick up the Wall Street Journal and understand the stuff in the econ section, and ignore the opinion section, right? Like that was my goal of teaching. And so go and be able to do the econ section, and like, you know, I would use things from The Economist and I would use other ones, but really I'd have like this base that I want them to know. And I think that's pretty standard for at least at the undergraduate level.
Pietro?
Yeah, so similarly, I use the Wall Street Journal, I use Financial Times, I use The Economist. Pretty much, you know, you try to look for colorful articles, and then such as they get attracted, and then from there you try to derive the economic principles that they are learning, right? And these journals, I mean, they're well written. Some of these journalists actually, they know what they're doing and they write in a very colorful fashion. So it's very easy to get the students attracted to those stories. And then your job is to get them into thinking, you know, not just, my problem many times with MBAs is that they are very good at talking about everything, but really you see that there's not much structure behind it, but they can chit chat and talk. So just organizing and structuring without cutting their thinking, because sometimes they're very clever and they have very good ideas, but you know, get them to structure something that they could read. You know, what do they extract from there that they really have learned, and then make them feel comfortable that, hey, I have learned something. You know, one exercise that I do many times is they read an article by a good journalist, but perhaps not such a good economist, and I try to ask them, what do you think is flaw in the arguments that they are making? And why would you argue in the other direction, right? And that's an exercise that they feel very rewarding, because they, you know, when they say, oh, if I had read this article from The Economist before the class, I would just eat in and believe everything they say. Now I think that there may be fundamental flaws in this argument and this other one. So doing that kind of exercise makes students feel very good, and I hope it makes them feel like they've learned something.
Thank you. Eileen, can I just take a sort of angle on this discussion, which is around data? Because I think one of the things I find, so, you know, teaching, say, a philosophy and economics student, that if they've gone into that for largely philosophy, they often have a chip on their shoulder and a fear of econometrics and statistics. What's your recommendation to people who are trying to teach kind of data analysis to non-economists or non-specialists?
Yeah, so I think it is important to bear in mind that they will be a little bit more afraid of the data and the statistics than when you teach economists or economic students, but also they might not have necessarily the tools in order. So the simple things like being able to understand like a diagram or to interpret a chart, they might not have that as well. So just being aware of that. And in terms of actually teaching them, I think there's actually a lot that you can get done by doing descriptive statistics alone. So with the textbook that I wrote doing economics, we don't even do regression. The furthest we get is like 2 sample t-tests, which we don't really call them t-tests, but in a very, very informal way of like comparing 2 groups. Because there's a lot there's a lot that you can do just by getting them to think about using data for communicating and framing it in a way where it's like telling a story with data. So they see this Excel spreadsheet of some numbers, but trying to get a story out of it. That helps with students, not just the non-economists, but also the economists. They're really happy to do these regressions and get lots of output and show it. But then you asking them, what is this telling us about the world, or what can we learn? Those are skills that all students actually struggle with.
Reminds me a lot of my supervising master's students on their dissertations, and I'm always like, eyeball the data, tell me what's in the data, and they just like, what, hang on, I've run like 500 regressions. And it's like, yeah, but what's the data telling you? So we had a question from people who signed up to attend the conference, which was more around, I guess, the profession and academics. But it does connect. So it connects to James's point about how he's not going to let most people in the classroom ever. And the question was, do you think economists struggle to engage with non-economists in general? And if you think they do, why do you think that's the case? So Eileen, I might start with you.
Yeah, so I think as Pedro mentioned earlier, there's definitely some perceptions about what economics is about. So, for example, being confused with finance, business, and like making money. And some students have thought that economics is just all about supply and demand. So people might not think that economics has the necessary tools to tackle these pressing issues in society, like climate change or inequality, when in fact there are many economic researchers that dedicate their careers to studying these issues. So I think there's an issue with communicating what exactly economists do. And I think relatedly, like economics is sometimes seen as a discipline that it's somewhat separate from the other social sciences. Like we don't really talk to the sociologists or the psychologists very much. And there are these concerns that economics is quite homogeneous, both in the kinds of people who become economists. So there's been things about, the gender gap has been a prominent issue, and the kinds of ideas that are presented in economics teaching and research. So like neoclassical versus alternative perspectives. So I think that those are some reasons why the economics community might struggle to engage with non-economists.
Thank you. James, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking through that, and I believe a lot of the people here are either teaching specialists or clinical professors, and I think we, at least in the education side of things, are kind of that bridge from what we would consider professional economists that are working in policy and that are going out and talking to the Fed and stuff, and the general public. We kind of bridge that gap a little bit. But the respect, maybe it's getting there, but like, at least at the university that I was currently at, like it was a clear caste system of like, here's the research faculty and here's the teaching faculty, right? Like not invited to the same meetings, not using the same research funding. Like it was very, different. And so I think the first step to really help with, economists in general engaging with non-economists and the more general public would be recognizing the specialization that a lot of teaching faculty around the globe do, and convincing them that, comparative advantage, if we want to speak the language, like there's a reason why we should be doing this. I think that helps. I do also, I remember I was at SUNY Plattsburgh, which is a small state school in upstate New York. And it was my first job. I was in the mid-20s, and my chair challenged me to write pieces for the local newspaper, because he was very much into like, we have a job to try and communicate to the general public about what we actually do. So that's just echoing the like, people don't know what we do. So I think that's the first thing. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Pedro, anything to add?
Yeah, so for a while I've been engaged with an economics blog in Spain, which we try to actually, the blog has to actually engage the public and try to talk their language, and I think we have got better over time in this. So it started in the 2008 economic crisis, so it was all talking about macro and the causes of the crisis and whatever. But more and more, the blog has turned into something in which we talk about our research and why our research is interesting. And I think we have got better at communicating. And it's engaging them. It's actually, for me, it's a very useful tool, and it's something that I need, because most of the work that I do right now is, field experiments and RCTs with companies and with public institutions, right? So it's very important to engage them and to show them, on the one hand, to show them that we can be useful, and that perhaps the way they are evaluating public policies or policies, is not the most methodology or the most powerful way they can do it, so that trying to go into causality is important, and understanding that we can teach them things about causality through experiments is important. But also, we need to talk their language, and I think it's something that we need to get better at, and that comes from experience. I remember, I'm happy because a few years ago it was me trying to go to institutions and convince them of things, and it was a complete failure. Now they are calling me to go and do things, so it's also much better. I think that the public is also getting better at understanding what we do and talking our language and finding value. So I would encourage all of us to use the fact that some people have done this work for us already, and the public understands us a little bit better, to actually use them to do interesting things.
I think before I ask the question from YouTube, does anyone in the audience want to share anything on this idea that, how we communicate? It could be with academics who are non-economists, or with the wider public. I mean, there's layers of this communication issue. Ramin?
I can go on and on. So I would say it would be a 5-minute rant from me.
What's your one piece of advice?
One piece of advice, rather than just concentrating on what we do, let's concentrate on what we achieved. Let's imagine you go, the way the engineers represent their own discipline. They don't talk about their calculation tools. They don't talk about general principles of physics, right? They talk about the bridges that they have built. So maybe if we shift to what have we achieved, rather than what's our methodology, look at this tool that I'm using, or economics is all about all subjects in the world, from dating to, inflation forecasts, right? Who would get interested in economics, on those grounds? Did we become economists because it's all about, all subjects, or it has very interesting tools? So one-liner, my suggestion is let's focus on what have we achieved.
Thank you. And I'm going to echo that by saying every economic seminar should start with, this is my results. This is why they're interesting. And then if you have time, tell me about the equations and the literature and the algebra, but that's what you want to know. I think Steffi's pointed out that this is all really important for employability skills, which of course it is. But, most academics are employed now. So them having the incentive to improve their communication with non-economists is an interesting area. So why they need to do that. Often it does come from external, a university puts pressure, or the Research Excellence Framework in the UK now has an impact element. So people go away and write their nice little bit about the great impact that they've had. But I like Pedro's point that when you see other people doing it, and there's kind of a group of people doing it, then it becomes easier to encourage people to communicate better. Let's take a step back to the classroom a little bit. So a question from Christian on YouTube. Hi, Christian. About not so much what you teach, but how you teach. So do you sort of do the traditional lecture seminar format, or do you use different types of teaching approaches? And James, I know you do, obviously in the past few years, you've had async and sync debates as well, and whether that difference is any different for different types of audiences?
Yeah, so my teaching strategies have changed so much since over the past 15 years since I've been doing it. And so my advice right now is to really spend time looking at what those scientifically backed, these evidence-based practices when designing the courses. And then once you've got that, the way that you deliver the material can be more of your comfortability, right? There's some really good research on, if you're more comfortable lecturing, as long as you're interspersing that with, clicker questions and, you're doing lots of quizzing and exams and you're doing recall exercises, then that's going to be fine. And there's also a lot of research that's if you want to flip the classroom, but again, you have to still do those basic ideas of how are we getting our students to practice active recall? How are we interleaving our stuff? How are we getting stuff to, stick in memory? And I don't think that changes for an economist, for a sociologist, for someone who's learning how to do improv theater, right? The cognitive science is going to be there on how to remember things, right? If I do a stand-up set, remembering where everything's going to go is the same way that I'm trying to teach my students to remember why marginal revenue is supposed to equal marginal cost and you go up to the demand curve, right? It's the same type of strategies. And so once you have that down, then really just feeling comfortable in the classroom. What makes you feel comfortable? What allows you to build trust with students? So that way they say, okay, what you're doing, I trust what you're doing is right. Even if it's hard, right? I know Eileen was talking about non-economists at the MBA or the higher level might come in a little scared because they don't feel like they're good at numbers. They don't have the data analysis. Well, we're scared because learning is hard. Learning is not easy. If you don't know something, it takes time to learn it. And we're afraid of things that are hard. That's just how humans are. So how do we as instructors become that coach really, that life coach to say, I understand it's hard. I'm here to help you get through the hard things. If you're with me, I promise it's going to be good. So that's my opinion. That's my advice and opinion. And it doesn't mean I'm right. There's lots of different.
James. Pedro, do you teach any differently compared to what you did when you were teaching economics students?
Definitely, but I think that's because hopefully I have become a better teacher, right? So at the beginning I was uncomfortable and I was, just following whatever textbook or whatever notes some colleague would give me. Now I feel like I know where I want to go, and what I try to do is always start with experience. So I try to teach every single topic with some kind of experiment in which the students see themselves making a decision. And then, we start with the experiment that the results may differ quite a lot from what I'm going to teach them. But then, what I can do is, okay, then I can try to see why the experiment actually didn't work, or what are the things that we would need to include in the way of thinking for this to make sense. So what are your reasons? But always starting with their own experience, and then I try to build in the material also from a critical perspective. So I think one thing that the students don't understand that well, and I don't know if they need to understand, is economic modeling, right? So I think by showing them that the models, that simple models, sometimes they don't work and they don't work for a reason, but what are the ingredients that you need to make to put into the model, etc., from the experience they have had before, allows them to learn also these things, and to learn the limitations of economic thinking, or what are even the things that we would need to add to the models. So, experimentation for me, it's related to my research, but it's also a fundamental part of my teaching.
Yeah, Eileen, do you teach any differently? I know you don't teach on the ground, but when you were thinking about teaching it through the textbook, did you think it was going to be standard lectures and seminars?
So I initially thought that when you teach non-economists, you would need a slightly different approach. But I think that after having written that textbook, both the Economy, Society, and Public Policy and the Doing Economics, I think that the general principles for designing materials and explaining economic concepts, what works for non-economists, actually economic students would benefit from them as well. So for example, in the clarity and the precision of language, so currently like core, we're updating our main textbook for economic students. And we actually think that some of the material or the way that models were explained, the way that we tried to do it for the non-economists actually works better in general. So we're going to put that back into the textbook for economics students. And so, yeah, and another example is that both economics and non-economic students would benefit from having these real world examples to motivate the more abstract content as well. So that's my take on it.
I've had a good question in the chat, which I'm kind of going to adapt a little bit to a question I had, which is, so a bit like all of you have been saying, I eventually started teaching economists in the way that so if you take something like the Foreign Office course that we run, when we were designing that and realizing these are busy professionals who are non-experts, we realized they can only pay attention for 15 minutes at a time or 20 minutes at a time to async materials. And that was a real lesson for us when we had to start doing things online with economic students. And there were lots of other things. But I did always have this little devil in my back or thing in my head, which was, what my colleagues think of me not teaching this in a standard economics way. But also, am I leaving too much out? So the question Jokwan had was around, you're trying to cover familiar everyday sort of situations. You want to throw in some experiments, case studies, have the news stuff, have data. And then, when you start working through that, you start going, okay, so I'm not going to be spending a day deriving Kernel models or something like that, which I got comfortable with, but then kind of went, okay, I hope nobody comes in and peer reviews me and finds out I'm not teaching the Kernel models. So how do you make that balance between, is it experiment every week, or 1 week's experiment, another week case studies, another week news, or how do you juggle all the different ways of getting their attention, getting their engagement, teaching them economics? Kedra, I'm going to start with you.
So I think its topic naturally lends itself to a particular type of teaching. Not, for example, you mentioned Kernel models. So that's a typical game theory theme where you can set up an experiment in competition very easily. But then quickly you need to talk about, do you think the CEO of Coca-Cola and Pepsi really think about these issues? What is the underlying principle there? So for that kind of thing, experiments are good. For other things, you need to use other materials. But I think you need to think through. It's not you use experiments for everything you do. That's not my message. I think for each thing that you do, you have to think carefully what is the best way, and also have enough confidence to not be afraid of your economics professor colleague coming in the class and, yeah, I don't teach the Kernel model. So what? I think we are all grown-ups. And as Ramin was saying, we should also show our colleagues what we achieve in terms of teaching by teaching non-economists. Hey, they learn all these things, they are able to read these things, they understand the principles, and I haven't solved them a single equation. They haven't run a single regression, but they know what a regression is, or things like that, right? So I like a lot the comment about what can we achieve with our teaching too.
James or Eileen, do you have a similar approach that it's sort of content determines how you teach?
Yeah, and I think instructors need to be comfortable with failing, right? We tell our students all the time how much they need to fail and learn and be okay with it. And then I meet with so many instructors, especially this is what I do with the improv sessions. We do improv sessions, like instructors are so afraid of having a bad lecture, so afraid, and it makes sense. There is a lot of pressure on it, but I remember I used to teach monetary policy and I would just hate it. I'd be like, I am doing something wrong here. I would loathe teaching monetary policy. So one year I was like, okay, I'm just going to revamp it and try something new. And I was so afraid of going in. I'm just going to spend the whole day on the Federal Reserve's website here in the US. And that's all I'm going to do, is I'm going to have them all get their computers and we're going to try something completely different. And it wasn't perfect, but I was able to tweak that. But the 3 years before, I was afraid to do something new, because I think very similar, like you were saying, is, well, if I'm not showing a money demand and money supply, and I'm not, showing them multiplier effects, is someone going to be upset with me? But I was like, you know what, I don't like what I'm doing in monetary policy, so I'm just going to try something brand new. And it just takes time. I don't think there's a science Joaquin, I don't think there's a science of like, you need to make sure you put 3 of these in and 2 of these in. It kind of just ends up being feel, which is what we don't like as scientists to say, but it's true.
Yeah, I think I've had the same experience with exchange rates this year, James. And I'm totally with Pram is laughing because my approach to this was ask Pram. But yeah, I'm totally going to do it a different way next year. And I think I may assume the world has no exchange rate and just deal with them that way. Or get a guest lecturing is my new approach to dealing with things I'm uncomfortable with. But there's always something. And I think, you know, I've had the exams today and I've had a week of questions on a forum about, you said this and it's actually this. And it's like, how many times do I have to write? Yes, I know, I was confused and I got everyone confused and this is actually how it works. But, you know, I'm old enough and big enough to be happy to do that now. Whereas I think when you're starting out, that is a much more uncomfortable position to be in. I have one more question for the panels, which they know about. But before I ask it, has anyone in the audience got anything else they want to ask or share? No. So my last question was really trying to marry this, you know, economists as communicators and teaching different types of students. And it was really just to get a reaction to the statement, which was every economist would be better at communicating their research ideas if they were required to teach at least one course to non-economists. And I'm going to give credit to this to Antonio Cabrales, who's not here, because this is something that he always says is by us making him teach non-economists at the Foreign Office, he feels like his ability to communicate his research got better. So Eileen, reaction to that?
Yeah, so I think that that statement, it brings an interesting idea about the possible synergies between teaching and research, like one being like both activities being able to inform each other. And I think that there are synergies that teaching economists and non-economists can benefit the way that you communicate as a researcher. Well, not just a researcher, but just communicating ideas in general and talking about economics and what you do to normal like lay people. But I think that also the way that economic teaching is currently organized, it might not take advantage of these potential benefits. So we did mention that some universities have, due to various incentives, they have these separate research and teaching streams. So some academics will not be doing much teaching at all, let alone teaching the non-economists. They don't even want to teach the economists. And I think in the UK, at least, the introductory economics courses, they tend to be taught separately for economists and non-economists. So I think in principle, the statement does sound like a good idea, but we do have a long way to go to make it a practical reality.
James, US perspective? A James perspective, even.
A James. I mean, sure, if the person required to teach the course took it seriously and learned how to actually teach the course, right? Because I think there's probably good people. You're right. I guarantee there are a lot of people who are like, I became a better communicator because I took teaching this class seriously. And I figured out a way to communicate my or other econ material to non-economists or 18, 19-year-olds. Perfect. But I don't know what percentage of those people are that. If I go and I tell economist X, who's, you know, working up towards their tenure clock, and they're like, why am I have to do this? Okay, fine. Give me a textbook. Here's Mankew's textbook. I'm just going to read through it, and I'm going to give them the test that's provided by the publisher. And like, oh, you made me teach this class, and I got nothing out of it. Well, of course you got nothing out of it because you didn't try. So I think on the surface, like, yeah, of course, this is true if the individuals take it seriously. But we do that with our students all the time too, right? Like, yeah. Would every econ student benefit if they read the textbook? Yes, they would. But are they going to do that? I don't know.
So we should force them and not give them tenure unless they've done it well.
Yeah, and then we have to figure out how we actually assess teaching well, which we do a very bad job at around the globe.
That's a whole other seminar. Pietro, last word.
So 2 stories. So I completely agree with the sentence. There is this thing that we say, no, you never learn anything until you have to teach it, right? So 2 personal stories. The first one is when I was an undergraduate student, the way I studied for my exams was by teaching some of my high school friends. You know, we were meaning to study together, but at the end, it turned out in me basically lecturing them. And that's the way I did succeed in my exams. And the second story is I never write my papers, my research papers, until I have talked to my mother-in-law, who is a 94-year-old woman who has never studied university. And I tell her about my research, and until I get a feeling that she really understands it and says, "Oh, Pedrito, this is interesting. I get it." That's when I know I can write the paper, and it really helps me. So it's useful, and we should all do it.
Yeah, I think that when I worked in the civil service, because even in professional economists are not always the best communicators, and I think when I've been designing courses with economists for the non-economists in different organizations, they're always like, "Oh, you have to cover average costs and you have to do fixed costs." It's like, why? So there's always a job of undoing their experience. But there used to be this phrase about, what would the person on the Clapham Common bus say, which is an area in London. And it was always that same kind of thing of, if you can't explain it to them, then you haven't got it right. So you'd be rewriting sort of public. And not everything we do is that public facing. You're obviously doing an academic course. But I do think pulling it back, but I'd go back to, there's experienced people who struggle to do this, but I do think the kind of work, James, that you are doing on trying to train up graduate students to help them be confident teaching in different ways is really important, because most of us start off by doing what we've seen, and being encouraged to take easy steps. So when you get to nearly 50, you might get a bit more comfortable with it. But if we can get the 25-year-olds coming out of PhD starting to do this, then that's where I think some of the revolution might happen. But okay, we're on 4 o'clock. So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And I hope those of you watching on YouTube have got something out of it as well. Thank you to Manisha, our new centre manager, for successfully organising her first seminar with us. We'll see you all soon. The sign up to attend our conference at the end of June will be going out shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And